Hi, I'm Parneet Jaggi, and today we will be starting a series of lectures on different literary terms. And the first in this series is going to be a discussion on the term myth. We often hear of this term as mythology. So let's understand what is myth along with a few examples from English literature. When we define myth, we define it as a legendary or a traditional story that usually concerns an event or a hero with or without using factual or real explanations. And these myths are particularly concerned with some kind of deities or demigods, and they also describe some practices, some rites, rituals, and some natural phenomenon. So typically, a myth involves historical events and also supernatural beings. Now, there may be many kinds of myths, such as classic myths, religious myths, and modern myths. Now, what are the chief features of these myths? What actually we find in these myths, and what runs as a common thread in all the myths? Let's look at this factor. So, the myths usually feature the ruling gods, goddesses, deities, and superhero kinds of figures that have godly qualities. But the status is lower than that of gods. They are not actually gods, but they enjoy an equivalent status because of their supernatural qualities. Often we see the characters like the son or daughter of a god, they are fully mortal, but they have supernatural abilities and powers that actually raise them above the average human beings. So they look different, they look extraordinary. Myths are mostly very old, and they happen to have ruled the world when our age, gadgets, science, philosophy, technology were not very prevalent, precise as they are today. So people are unaware of certain questions. Like in the old age, in the olden times, people were not actually educated or skilled to know such natural phenomenon as why the sky was blue, why the night is dark, what are the causes of floods, earthquakes, and these calamities. So these were the myths that explained these natural phenomena and described the various rituals and ceremonies involved in the understanding of these phenomena to the people. Now, when we look at a myth from the perspective of literature, we need to illustrate this phenomena, this term, through literature. So, the first example that comes to mind is William Shakespeare, of course, the famous Elizabethan playwright, whose drama, Romeo and Juliet, I'm going to illustrate here. Now, we often hear of the Roman and Greek myths. Even in today's cinema, Hollywood also, we have innumerable Greek myths being mentioned and shown in plenty. Although they are not originally available in English, but they have deeply influenced English works throughout the literary history. Now, during the times of the ancient Greeks, there was a belief that some invisible gods, such as Zeus, had created this world. And we read in such Greek stories that passions for humans controlled the gods, and hence gods fought for them. Likewise, even Romans had beliefs in such deities. So we can even relate to these deities and these supernatural mythological heroes through the contemporary Hollywood movies. Like we have this Greek gods like Zeus in movies like Clash of the Titans and such popular film series also. They actually come from these mythological backgrounds through which we learn certain things about the natural phenomenon. Now, due to mythological influences, many literary authors refer to the Greek and Roman myths in order to add meanings to their works. For example, in Romeo and Juliet, Juliet cries out saying, "Gallop apace, you fiery-footed steeds, towards Phoebus's lodging." Now, Phoebus is a famous myth in Greek mythology. Phoebus was god of the sun. And here, Juliet urges that God to bring him home quickly so that night could come and she may meet her lover Romeo. Another example taken from the famous modern poet William Butler Yeats, W.B. Yeats, his famous poem No Second Troy. Now, there's another Greek myth in which we often hear of that girl called Helen. Greeks devastated the city of Troy in an outburst of the Trojan War when Helen, the wife of King Menelaus, ran away with the prince of Troy. Now, she was a very beautiful woman from Greece and was ultimately held responsible for lots of wars and for the ultimate devastation of that city, Troy. Now, Yeats is trying to use this Greek mythological allusion in his poem, No Second Troy, as he is creating a parallel, a similarity between this beauty of Helen and the beauty of his friend Mordgon. He also juxtaposes Trojan War and the revolutionary and anti-British activities of the Irish. Just like Helen, Yeats blamed and held Mordgon responsible for creating hatred in the hearts of Irishmen, and consequently, they caused destruction and bloodshed. Now, we need to know here that Yeats was himself a revolutionary poet and a freedom fighter in his Irish freedom struggle, although he was very fond of this girl Mordgon, but somewhere he held her responsible for the destruction of the Irish freedom. So the next example that I'm going to take up is the famous long poem, the epical poem by John Milton, Paradise Lost. As the title indicates, it is about paradise. Now, the biblical stories and myths have always played an important role in English literature. And Milton, in his poem Paradise Lost, actually takes the entire scene of paradise. The setting is paradise, and it highlights the story, the Genesis story about the fall of man, how man fell from paradise to earth, and how he was evicted from the Garden of Eden. Now, apart from this, we also had writers like William Golding, John Steinbeck, whose novels, like Golding's novel Lord of the Flies, also played on the same idea of myths and allusions in medieval literature. Now, taking up the most metaphorical, the most symbolic, the most mythical poem of the century, of the 20th century, that is The Wasteland by Thomas Stearns Eliot. Now, Eliot uses two underlying myths to develop the structure of his long poem, The Wasteland. Now, these myths are of the Grail, the Holy Grail quest, and the Fisher King, both of which originate from Gallic traditions and come towards the Christian civilization. Although we also have other mythical kingdoms like Oedipus and all, but these were the two main highlighted myths in Wasteland. Now, these have not been taken from the Bible, but they are significant myths of Europe, of England, of English literature, because they have incorporated repeatedly in English literature. Now, let's understand why so many writers, thinkers, philosophers, especially poets, have been using myths in their works. What is the function of the myth? Now, myth exists in every society because they are basically elements of human nature. So the main function of myths is to teach moral lessons and to explain the historical events that we might forget over a period of time. Authors of great literary works have often taken their stories and themes from myths. Myths and their mythical symbols lead to creativity in literary works. Now, we can understand a culture more deeply, more intensely, more closely, and in a much better way by knowing and appreciating its stories, its dreams, its illusions, and its myths. Myths came before religions, and all religious stories are, in fact, retellings of global mythical themes. Now, beside literature, myths also play a great role in science, psychology, and philosophy. But here, since we are only concerned with literature, so we have tried to understand the concept of myth through the literary works and the allusions taken in these literary works which have been written by famous writers. So we'll move on to the next literary term like fable and elements of drama in the coming lectures. Thank you for now. Stay tuned.